We had direct conversations with the Chancellor, who's now the Prime Minister, around setting up the self-employment income support scheme, and then talking to the media and briefing the media about that as well. I think that Kay Adams has said, has pointed out that HMRC kind of has this bottomless pit of taxpayers' money. If they don't like the result they're getting from one tribunal, they can just keep going and keep going. And eventually the taxpayer might give in. Now, she didn't give in. She kept on fighting the good fight. Some commenters say the Conservative Party is they've got lots of problems at the moment if you look at the polls. And one of their problems is that they've got this Reform Party, which is taking a lot of their votes on the right. And they've said that they would like to scrap R35, scrap the Chapter 10 reforms. So can that be used to put pressure on the Conservatives to come up with a similar line? Because I do feel like if we can shine a spotlight on what's going on here, my hope is that someone in government is going to say, what are we doing? Why are we picking on these actually rather compliant businesses?
Exactly.
Why would we do that? Why would we go and try to ruin these businesses? Some of the areas that we're going to be pushing the government on is around, obviously, the tax system, R35. We would love to make some good progress with the MSC stuff, and whether that's supporting our members in the tribunals, which might happen this year, I don't know, or in Parliament and with policymakers as well. We'd love to get. I feel like that's an area that we could maybe make some progress on, because it just feels so unfair what's going on. That I feel like if we can get into the right audience here, we can make a case that could be quite compelling for why something needs to change around that.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Your Own Account. I'm Nicole Slowey.
And I'm Seb Maley.
And we are joined today by the Director of Policy from IPSE, Andy Chamberlain.
Hi, good to be here.
Welcome, Andy. So, got lots we want to talk about today.
Yeah, well, I think a good starting point is maybe talking a bit about IPSE and kind of what the organisation does. I mean, if you had to give a kind of 90-second elevator pitch, what would that be?
So we're a membership organisation. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and we exist to represent the self-employed in the UK. And we advocate on behalf of the whole self-employed population, not just our members, but of course for our members we also offer them a series of benefits and services which help them with their business.
Yeah.
But the bit that I do, which is sort of why we were created in the first place, is to try to persuade the government that working for yourself is a good thing for individuals, for the businesses that use them, and for the UK economy as a whole.
Yep.
That's my 90 seconds.
Okay.
Was that about 90 seconds?
Yeah, I think that was about right.
Yeah.
And in terms of the history of IPSE, then, where did it stem from? And I know you've got there's an anniversary coming up this year, isn't there? Right?
Yeah, we're 25 years old this year. So initially we were the Professional Contractors Group. Yep. That was the initial name, and it was effectively a campaign group that a bunch of contractors got together in opposition to IR35. So at our core, IR35 is still a major issue for the organisation. Yeah. But we also talk about lots of other things as well now. Yeah. So we're not just a one-issue campaign. But the Professional Contractors Group kind of just became the acronym PCG. Yeah. And then people couldn't remember what PCG stood for, so we changed the name to IPSE, which is the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed. I think that name change was about 2015. Yeah. I joined in 2010, so I've been there for most of the history of the organisation, but I missed out on that sort of seminal 10-year period, and I certainly wasn't there at the very beginning. But it was as far as the folklore goes, it was just a group of contractors which got together, threw some money into a hat, and kind of started this thing. And one of the things that they did was they formed an online forum, which was one of the first, so we're led to believe, perhaps one of the first kind of online kind of organisations that cropped up, because it was effectively that was it. It was this online forum. Yeah. And that forum is still going today for members, so they can still go in there and post on there. But at one point, I think that was part of the identity, and it became a very lively discussion forum.
I remember it well, actually. There was you had a lot of the sort of characters on there who presumably is still involved.
There's still quite a few characters knocking around. Yes, so we've still got. I still talk to people today that are members of IPSE, and one is there's a chap called Philip Ross, who I think he was on the board of PCG. Yeah. He's still a member of IPSE. He's in our policy and research committee, which is a committee of members, and we regularly talk to him. And he's got great links into the Labour Party, so he and I have done quite a lot of lobbying together of the Labour Party and things. So, there's a real community there, and sadly, quite a few of those original members have actually passed on now. That's how we're sort of getting to that age where people who are perhaps in their 50s when it started. So that's where the organisation is. Yeah, and I think in May, that's when it was incorporated originally. So there is a bit of some sort of birthday celebration planned for this coming springtime. Yeah,
brilliant. Yeah, okay. And how did you end up working for IPSE then? What was your background?
I was interested in politics and did politics at university and worked for an MP, and then I was looking for a role outside of Parliament. I was working in Parliament as a sort of researcher. Yeah, it came up, and I applied for that and went to go and work for it. And I was thinking, I remember going to the interview and thinking, I've got to brush up on this IR35 stuff. I didn't know anything about that kind of thing at all. It wasn't in my background at all. But I was very interested in people working for themselves. I myself had worked for myself on a very casual basis for most of my student period and even before that while I was at school. So while other people had a Saturday job down in the high street or whatever, I was doing things like mowing people's lawns and looking after their
entrepreneurial.
I don't know if I can probably go. It seems a stretch to say that I was going that far, but certainly I was interested in that. People working for themselves. I think there's always been something about it that's appealed to me. I am now actually an employee of IPSE's. But and I always feel the need to sort of explain that to people because I think they might think that we're all freelancers, but in fact we do use some freelancers, but we have quite a few employees as well. But I definitely am interested in that style of working, working for yourself, self-employment, the issues that throws up, the difficulties that it causes, which I've learned about since joining PCG/IPSE around taxation, but also wider things around employment status, around whether or not this is something that people want to do for a very long period of time for their whole career, whether it's something they do for little bits at a time. I just find it very interesting. And, it's not, I don't think that self-employment is necessarily for everyone. I think we're fairly careful at IPSE not to sort of go around saying everyone should be self-employed. But we do know that for a lot of people, they really do like it. And they wouldn't work any other way. And I do think that out there is also people for whom it's perhaps not their first choice. And we need to look at that too. And I think that, there has been some focus on that in recent years. And I think that that's right. And we've always said at IPSE, self-employment is not an excuse for a would-be employer to absolve themselves of their responsibilities. You can't just turn around and say, you know what, wouldn't it be great if we just said everyone here is self-employed and we don't have to worry about giving them holiday pay or paying employers national insurance or any of this other stuff.
Which does happen. It does happen.
Yeah, so you got and this is all part of the difficulty. And then you get the problem where any government's going to, if that's highlighted to them, will look at that and be concerned about it and maybe take steps to stop it. But then you've got the problem that you could be actually stopping other people who generally want to be self-employed from being self-employed. And how do you police that? And it's not easy. And as far as I'm aware, every country in the world has struggled with this. And no one's got the perfect answer to it. But I do think it's a very interesting area of kind of public policy. And the closer you can get to the right answer on that, the better it will be for everyone, not just the individuals, but the economy as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And what does a kind of typical day look like for you then? What's
a typical day for me? Well, it does sort of depend on kind of what we're working on at the time, but we do quite a lot of research. Yeah. So we've actually, I hope you don't mind me plugging up, launched our survey. I know that Qdos did a survey recently as well, and a lot about IR35. So we've just done our Spotlight survey, which is we started this last year, and over the years we've done loads of research on IR35, but we're trying to put in place something that we can measure year on year, so that we can try to test the temperature basically of what's going on out there. Are people finding inside work roles only? Are they finding outside roles? What are their rates like depending on the two different roles? If they have to work inside, are they going towards umbrella company working? So we're just so that we can track it over time and see what's happening out there in the market, basically. So we've just launched that. So there's a bit of work in doing that and then promoting it and trying to get responses and all of that. And you've got to get it back and do the analysis. We do quite a lot of webinars as well, so online events where we talk about certain policy areas. Something that I hope we might touch on today is around managed service company legislation. We have a group of members who are having a really torrid time with an investigation that's going on around that, and so we're meeting with that group tomorrow. To sort of stay in touch with them, you know, and make sure that they know that we're still here and we're helping them a bit with those investigations. I think that you guys are doing similar things for others as well. I mentioned the Policy and Research Committee. We've got that this week where we get together with members. We have to plan for that, prepare for it, host a meeting, get views. We're thinking about the election this year and doing a manifesto. Got to write that. Creating content, so stuff like this, or whether it's written content for our website. So these are the sorts of things that seem to fill up.
So not busy at all then. No.
Well, basically, it doesn't. You think it doesn't sound like much, but then you don't have any time. You don't. This is. It takes up so much time doing this stuff, which I love it, and we've got a great team at IPSE. So every day is quite. It's enjoyable work. It's good.
I know we've done a couple of kind of speaking events together before, and you've been on things like BBC Breakfast, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
is that something that you've always been comfortable with? Because you come across as very natural in front of an audience or in front of camera. Is that something that you have kind of learnt? Or
learn on the job, learn that on the job, that stuff. So we have, when we did, we were getting bits and pieces of media. When I joined PCG, as it was then in 2010, R35 was a little bit of a dead issue. And then the coalition government came in, and do you remember they created the Office of Tax Simplification, which has recently actually just been
very recent
scrapped, which is maybe a bit of a shame because they were doing some interesting stuff there. But one of the first things that they then did was look at R35. So we had a little bit of interest then and a little bit of lobbying work to do. Nothing much in the media really, just hints of interest really. But then when the public sector changes came in 2017, media got a bit more interested in it. And then when it looked like it was coming in originally in 2019 and then 2020 and then because of the pandemic 2021, there was quite a bit of interest in IR35 because now all of a sudden all business had this problem. It wasn't just contractors. And so we got quite a bit of media there. And then when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of media attention then because we were talking up for freelancers and self-employed people that were this awkward fit around the some of the packages which were designed and we don't need to go back into it all now, but there was a lot, if you recall, there was lots and lots of talk at the time around how can we help the self-employed, and then what they did come out with helped some self-employed people actually quite generously. And
I think IPSE were quite pivotal in that.
So we had direct conversations with the Chancellor, who's now the Prime Minister, around setting up the self-employment income support scheme. And then talking to the media and briefing the media about that as well. And then we welcomed that scheme, but we really hope that there'd be something that could be done to address the clear and obvious gaps that were left behind, and were very frustrating that we were never really able to plug those gaps. There was some improvements around some newly self-employed people that were able to apply for it in the next tax year. But overall, it was hard work getting once the government had set out its stall and said this is what we're doing. They were very rigid, we found, in sort of making it, even discussing any sort of changes to that. And of course, those who ran their own limited company, which is lots of IPSE members, run their own company, they weren't very well helped at all. You're either an employee or you're a sole trader and you got something. But if you were a company director, there wasn't a lot going on for you.
It's the people talk about it as the forgotten
Limited.
So there was a campaign group called the Forgotten Limited that were very active on Twitter. Gina Broadhurst was the woman who was sort of spearheading a lot of that stuff, who I actually weirdly know from the school gates because her kids go to the same school that my kids do. So we would see each other there when we weren't homeschooling because it was the pandemic.
Those were the days, weren't
they? So media stuff really kicked off then, and then so we do get to do quite a bit of media. It's a good way to get your messaging out there, and I think if you are in the business of trying to persuade the government or policymakers to make changes, it's very helpful to make a bit of background noise
Absolutely.
in the media.
Definitely.
It sort of sharpens the minds of those
Exactly.
policymakers.
Yeah, exactly.
And how do you find that kind of media engagement when you're taking quite niche, sometimes tax technical points and trying to explain it to like kind of journalists across the board? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah. Well, I hope, is it okay to use this example? Because so Seb and I are both quoted in the newspaper today in the same article talking about managed service company legislation.
Yeah.
Now, that's a classic, right?
Yes.
For years, I've been really struggling to explain IR35 to journalists. And now I'm going, well, this other thing, managed service company. And it's even harder. It's even harder to explain that. So, that's a real skill. And we've got great people at IPSE in my team who the knack is to try and write that kind of like that quote where it sort of explains it in a clear way, which doesn't oversimplify it, but simplifies it enough so that it's accessible to not just a journalist, but whoever's reading from that, whoever's going to sort of be absorbing that news report. And that's a skill. That's difficult to do. It's not straightforward. No. Tax isn't that sexy. People don't really want to listen to endless debates about it. When it gets really personal, you definitely can see that. And what I mean by that is when you understand the sort of personal stories behind it, the impact it has on people, etc. Yeah. An obvious example of that would be the loan charge, where we've seen media stories actually coming out and what those stories tend to focus on is the impact this has had on taxpayers and on their families, etc. Yeah. And there's been some very, very tragic impacts there. And that obviously you can get media attention around that impact, even if the technical details of what's actually gone on is a bit difficult to get across at times.
Yeah. I suppose there's whilst tax is definitely not sexy, we've had a lot of high-profile individuals who have been the target from an IR35 point of view. Over recent years.
That's true. So because it used to be kind of not that, right?
No.
So before when was the one that I always think of was a TV presenter on BBC Look North called Krista Ackroyd. And that seemed to be, you tell me if I'm wrong, but that felt like that was the first in front of camera personality
it was.
that had the IR35 case. I think that she lost that appeal and HMRC I think won that case. I think. And then since then we've had
kind of relentless.
We've had a lot. We've had a lot of big names. Lorraine Kelly, obviously like a really big one, and I think she won her case. We've just had the conclusion, thankfully for her, of Kay Adams, of course. Yeah. I heard her on Radio 4. On Women's Hour last week, I think.
Yeah, she's been quite outspoken about the experience, hasn't she?
And just how difficult that whole period has been for her. And she really has she's been through the ringer, obviously going to the first tier, which she won. HMRC appealed up a tier. She won. HMRC appealed. Court of Appeal said, well, no, go back to the first tier. Yeah. She went to the first tier. She won. And now HMRC, after thinking about it for a few weeks, said, actually, we won't appeal it anymore.
And that's been, what, 10?
It's 9 or 10 years
or something. Yeah.
And I think for kind of general people in the public, it's thinking about, right, well, obviously there is an amount, a tax liability amount that HMRC are trying to pursue in those types of scenarios. But the money that they have to then spend to take it through those kind of different processes and stages of a kind of court, it's a lot. And I think that a lot of people are questioning, well, what is HMRC's strategy in that respect? If it's how much is it costing them to fight these cases versus the actual amount of tax that there is to kind of to get out of being successful in their pursuit of it.
Yeah. Well. I mean, I think I'm right in saying Kay has said, Kay Adams, I'm not really on first name terms with her. She did speak at our Freelancer Awards last summer, which was great. Yeah, she hosted our awards.
Wow.
We didn't, nothing to do with her case. We just she was just a really good personality to do those awards. And I was lucky enough to have a good chat with her backstage about her IR35 case as well, which was still very much live at that time. Yeah. But I think that Kay Adams has said, has pointed out that HMRC kind of has this bottomless pit of taxpayers' money. If they don't like the result they're getting from one tribunal, they can just keep going and keep going. And eventually the taxpayer might give in. Now, she didn't give in. She kept on fighting the good fight. But I think I'm right in saying, has said that the total amount that she spent on legal defence probably has eclipsed the amount that HMRC were asking for, but only because she wanted to, make the point that she hasn't avoided any tax, that what she was doing was perfectly legitimate. Good for her. The fact that she's doing that just goes to show that, just because HMRC say that you owe a load of money under IR35 doesn't mean you do.
No.
And they are pushing the boundaries of what the law says, because they're all, I think they themselves, I think HMRC itself has said that there are these difficult cases in between and they need to take them to tribunal to get clarity on what the law means. But what they really mean is to assert their view of what the law means, and they keep on going until they find someone in the court system that will agree with them. You could argue that. And they say, there we go, we've got it, we've got what we needed. So and there's Gary Lineker's another one, isn't he? He's got, I think his upper tier, so he's won at the first tier, but the upper tier tribunal is this month. I thought
it's soon, isn't it?
Soon.
I mean, that is an incredibly nuanced.
That's a weird one because he's working for a partnership. And did he have a direct contract, as in he, the individual Gary Lineker, and not Goldhanger Productions or whatever his company's called that was interacting or engaged by BBC and BT Sport and all this sort of stuff. So that is a strange. It's a weird one. That is a weird.
But
one,
it certainly helped to boost the profile of I-35 and to kind of bring it some public attention, hasn't it?
I think the point is as well is that all of these kind of unique, more notable names in these cases aren't really representative of most contractors and how they actually operate in their kind of day-to-days. Most people aren't a brand or on kind of primetime TV in the day or commentating on sport and things like that, and how much do these types of cases actually relate to your everyday IT contractor, as an example?
I don't know. I think that they do, don't they? Because they're still looking at those old-fashioned, substitution and neutrality of obligation and all this sort of stuff and control. So they're still focused on that, and then a lot of focus on business on own account as well, which is kind of that's where it does get interesting. So that was what the Kay Adams case was initially made to be all about by the courts, and that they sort of seemed to say, well, Kay Adams is clearly in business on her own account, and therefore IR35 doesn't apply to her engagement. But that does take us a little bit away from how we've all understood those cases. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to sort of get overly technical because I'll be out of my depth very quickly. But the idea is that that's a secondary consideration, and that IR35 is considered on an engagement by engagement basis. In other words, I might have one engagement with, I don't know, the BBC over here, which is caught by IR35, but I might have one with ITV over here, which isn't. But if we're saying, no, what's of primary importance is that whether I'm in business on my own account, that would suggest they're all one or the other. I'm either in business on my own account and then any engagement I go and do. And this, of course, is quite difficult for the new world, if that is how we're to understand IR35, or to begin to understand it in that way a bit more, which is what a couple of recent court cases have focused on. That is quite difficult, I think, for the new way that off payroll works.
Definitely.
Because how's a client? We all know that they now advertise roles as inside or outside. Well, how do you know it? And I know that we're not at the moment saying that it's primary whether people are in business or own account or not. But if we're going towards that as like a primary consideration. Am I getting too technical?
No, you're not. It's an absolutely valid point.
Do you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? So how can you say, this is inside IR35 when you don't know who you're working with yet? Because what happens if you end up working with Kay Adams, who it's been proven is in business in her own account? See what I mean? I
think that's something that we've always tried to factor into kind of to our process, in that we kind of involve both. In Chapter 10 with the reformed off payroll rules, we involve both the client, as in the engager, but then also ensure that we involve the contractor at a certain point as well, so they can feed in all of that kind of pertinent information that is unique to them. Whereas if if a client is just using CEST and generating a result, then they're not going to be able to, all of that will be missed. So it does miss out potentially a huge piece of the jigsaw.
Yeah. I mean, the worry, of course, is just to sort of slightly change tack on the off payroll, and this is sort of what we're trying to keep an eye on with this research that we're doing, is that everyone's just so scared to decide that an engagement is outside of R35, because you only get a problem if you've got a potential liability created, usually for an agency, but it might be for an end client if they don't have an agency in the chain. And so it's sort of like your influence just say everything's inside. But what that does is it cuts down on the innovation that contractors bring. Yeah. And so we're missing out on a bit of that. So we've got to get that balance right. I'm not saying that we should necessarily just let anyone work for, in any circumstance, any engagement, it's perfectly fine to call that freelance or self-employment. Yeah. Sometimes it's not. Yeah. Sometimes it does. It is more like an employment. Yeah, absolutely. And they should be employed, actually. Yeah. I personally, and I think IPSE, we are generally of the view that we would prefer it if it looks like an employment, it should be an employment. A genuine employment. An actual employment with employment rights and employment contract and employment taxes all in one, rather than what we have at the moment, which is sort of like, you have to pay employment taxes. It's
kind of a no man's land.
Yeah, kind of this no man's land. Yeah. I think that would be a much better place to get to. And then you can say it's easier said than done. I'm not saying it's easy. No, it's definitely not easy. Yeah. But what we have at the moment is this kind of some people call it zero rights employment, don't they? Yeah. Which is this world in which you can get to a place where someone somewhere has decided you've got to pay tax like an employee, but you're not really an employee. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that's quite right.
No. Yeah. No, it's not.
So we know that there's improvements to be made there. We just don't know how to get there.
Yeah. Continuing on from, we've talked a bit about the new rules, so Chapter 10 when we're talking about IR35 reform. So we're nearly 3 years kind of post-reform. What is your view, or kind of IPSE's view, as to the longer-term impact that that's had to the contractor market and still continues to have at the minute?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I'd love to tell you in a few weeks when we get our survey back. My sense has been that there was an initial knee-jerk reaction to Chapter 10, and it was very bad. And we all know, in the financial services sector, the big banks all kind of did the blanket ban thing where they just said, from now on, that's it. No more working through a limited company ever. I think that anecdotally, it seems like some of them are actually softening their position a little bit on that. There's a bit more of a realization that, actually, we can engage someone outside of IR35 through their own limited company, and it's perfectly compliant. It's not that we're not doing something dodgy. We're not getting around the rules. There is a world in which that is an appropriate way to engage someone, and I think that some of those clients are beginning to sort of understand that a little bit more. Whereas initially, I think they thought, "Oh, this looks really complicated. I don't want to." I feel like HMRC are sort of suggesting that we shouldn't be engaging people in this way anymore, so we're just not going to engage people in this way. I think now they're beginning to hopefully be a bit more nuanced about that. But I still think that if there's any kind of doubt whatsoever, a cautious client will just say it's inside of IR35 rather than maybe spending a bit more time examining it and thinking, actually, if we arrange this in a certain way, this can be a perfectly good outside of payroll contract. So and then so the wider impact has been, I think, we have seen some people have retired earlier than they might have done anyway. Now they were probably coming towards the end of their working careers, but they might, and then with the pandemic as well, that all happened around the same sort of time. And now we have this problem where we don't have enough people in our labour market. One thing we've kept on saying to the government is, if you really want people to work, Jeremy Hunt said, maybe about a year ago, just ahead of one of the budgets or the autumn statements, he says something like, we need people to get off the golf course and get into it. And those are the people, those guys, they are the people, and girls, are the people who are, I think, some of them are impacted by R35. They're perhaps, getting towards the end of their careers. A lot of people, it's a very popular thing to do is go and work for yourself when you get to that stage. A lot of people recognise that setting up a limited company is a sensible way to compliantly go about doing your business and working with your clients. And now the IR35 rules are coming, they just said, "I'll just forget it." No, I can't be bothered with this. I have to go into an umbrella company or something. It's not for me. I'm just not going to work. So I think we've seen that as an impact.
Yeah.
There has also been some offshoring of work. Now, this is very hard to capture evidence on, but anecdotally, you hear lots of people, and clients will tell you, yeah, we do. We have actually work that we used to source inside the UK. We're now going outside the UK
out
to
to
do
the
it.
consultancies or
It's not just IR35, but IR35 is another hassle that we find when we stay in the UK. So why do we need that? We don't need to do that. We can go and get it elsewhere.
Yeah.
So these things are negative drags on our economy. I think it's not great for us that this is happening. And IR35 is one of those areas. I say IR35. I know off payroll is how we should say it.
Well, but it's just we say the same thing.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those areas that the government could look at again and think about how can we get this into a bit better shape so that some of these impacts that we're talking about are less likely to happen. But they're quite stubbornly sticking to it for the time being. Yeah. You know, it's our job to try and persuade them to think again about that, and we will continue to try and persuade them to do that. But that's an area that I think we could look at, and it could make some improvements to our economy.
And what do you think the kind of appetite of that is in terms of us being on the precipice of a general election? Is any one party more likely to kind of do a bit of a review of payroll rules?
Well, I hope that we might be able to persuade all the parties to do it, which we have done. We have been here before. So I think it was before 2019 when the changes were sort of being talked about coming in, and we had the general election there, and then one by one we persuaded each party to make a commitment to look at the IR35 rules again, and then they all did. So and there's that sort of electoral pressure for them to commit to that. Then the Conservatives obviously won that, and they did have a review of IR35, which I went to, and I went into the Treasury and spoke to the Financial Secretary at the time, was Jesse Norman. Who was, Jesse Norman is a good guy. But they kind of made up their minds what they were going to do. They didn't make any difference.
No.
And we said it should have had an independent chair. But it was chaired by the government minister who was in charge of who's responsible for the policy. So it was a frustrating experience. That review. It was so hopefully we can do a bit better this time around, and we certainly will be putting pressure on all the parties. I mean, some commenters say the Conservative Party is they've got lots of problems at the moment if you look at the polls. And one of their problems is that they've got this Reform Party which is taking a lot of their votes on the right, and they've said that they would like to scrap IR35, scrap the Chapter 10 reforms. So can that be used to put pressure on the Conservatives to come up with a similar line? I mean, I think maybe, but you do have this problem that the Prime Minister actually does understand this area quite well. And he believes in Chapter 10. He actually supports the policy personally. So it's difficult to persuade the Conservative Party with the current leadership that they should change direction on this area. I would say it's difficult. With a new lead, if things change and they get a new leader in place, who knows? I think it's all up for grabs.
Well, we've seen that with the Truss Kwarteng.
Well, exactly. But I think with the current leadership, it's going to be a challenge to persuade the Conservatives to take a different tack. The Labour Party are interesting because they're talking about quite a lot of this different area around employment status, etc. I'm not sure that they will be. So I think that sort of when we talk to the Labour Party, we tend to go in from the angle that we need to look at employment status rules rather than just saying look just at the IR35 stuff, because they seem to close that down. They don't seem to be so interested in that. But when we say, but the problem is that we don't understand employment status in this country, so no one knows whether something's employed or self-employed. If we could make some progress on that and get it a bit clearer, that could be a very helpful way to deal with off payroll. Because it might be that some of those people that are currently in that grey area that are constantly fighting these battles over whether things are inside or outside of IR35, they might find that suddenly, because they genuinely are self-employed, they're able to work outside of IR35 a bit more easily. So the Labour Party are definitely interesting to talk to about employment status and about kind of the future of work stuff. They haven't made any mega real commitments on it, apart from saying they're going to ban 0-hour contracts, which isn't really us anyway. That's about employees. I'm not sure that it's a particularly good idea to ban 0-hour contracts, because if you look at all the research, you often find people say that they like it if they're on those kind of contracts. So you have to take that into consideration.
Yeah.
But I do think that maybe with a Labour Party coming in with energy and a fresh set of ideas and a bit more of an open mind, we might be able to look at some of the difficult areas like employment status, and that could have a positive impact on people.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, with the I-35 and the off-payroll rules, it's not necessarily legislation itself; it's the determining factors. It's that myriad of confusing areas when we're basically case law is based on cases that go back to the 1960s.
Yeah.
And we're,
ready-mix concrete.
Exactly.
We love a bit of ready-mix concrete. Yeah.
I mean,
seminal case.
Is that really how we should be determining status in 2024?
Well, indeed. It feels like it's crying out for a bit of a look at this. And of course, we did look at it. There was a consultation, wasn't there, in 2018 or something?
Yes.
So there was for those that can remember this, there was that Matthew Taylor review of modern working practice, which was very influential at the time. Do you remember? Not many reports have an impact, but one really had a big impact.
Yeah, it did.
And it was commissioned by the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, as well. So I think that was helpful, that the Prime Minister had said, I want you to look at this. Matthew Taylor did that report, and he said, we need to look at this employment status rules. The government said, okay, fine. Had a consultation. We all responded to it and spent ages, finessing our responses like we do.
Yeah.
And then nothing.
Yeah.
And then about 4 or 5 years later, the government said, we're just not going to do anything about that.
Exactly. And it was so disappointing because everything, there were so many good things that came out of that Taylor report and really interesting things, and actually got people thinking about a lot of these issues that we've all talked about for a really long time, but the masses have probably not really given it a huge amount of thought. And then, like you say, 4 or 5 years later, we'll move on to something else.
I mean, there are some things that he said that did happen, right? So I think I'm right in saying that the key information document kind of came about as a result of that report, because he said on day one everyone should know. So I think that there are things like that have come out. Now, I know that they themselves, you're probably about to say, Nicole, they're is that really working? Because some people aren't getting them. I agree with you. I agree. How effective is that actually at helping people 100%. To understand their status and all the rest of it? Probably could be improved. I agree. But my point is that there were some things that he recommended that kind of the government accepted all of his recommendations apart from 1 or 2, I seem to remember. And some of it was actually implemented, and others of it just was kicked into the long grass, like employment status. But it probably has made a bit of a difference, I think, that report, even now. But there's so much more.
It's still often referred to, isn't it? It's so, as you say, very influential. But,
I think that the holy grail is the kind of alignment of tax status and employment status was one of the kind of headlines from his report, which we kind of often come back to, but we know that the government doesn't quite have. What we've said before, the Margaret Beale's report and review of the similar things came out and said, well, there just isn't government appetite to actually to consider that, and that's
disappointing.
It is, because like you say, when we're talking about some people who are in that 0-hour contract space, you've got your gig workers, you then have your zero rights contractors who are kind of working inside IR35 for tax purposes but don't have any rights. It's complex, and there's a real mixture and a real breadth of different types of people who are in situations either through choice, and they're happy to be a 0-hour contracts worker, happy to be a contractor operating outside of IR35, but it's all those complex cases in the middle where people find themselves in a situation that they don't actually want to be in, and they're being forced to work in a certain way where they are potentially missing some vital rights or being pushed into a tricky kind of tax situation as well. Yes.
And sometimes I think it would be very useful for the government to... So let's talk a bit about that. These examples where there are people who find themselves in a self-employed role that didn't really choose that, find it a bit odd. They're still being told what to do day in, day out by someone. They don't have a lot of autonomy, really. They can't really go off and start working for someone else if they feel like it. Even though legally they might be able to, it just that's not part of their daily thing. How do we go about helping them? And the really awful thing is that if you attack it from a tax perspective only, HMRC 9 times out of 10 are going to be focusing all their investigations on the individual. This individual who said, "I didn't want to be here in the first place." Yeah. And this is what we've seen with quite a few areas of policy. And I think this is another thing that government could really look at this and think, who's actually at fault here? Isn't it? Wouldn't it be better to go and focus on that would-be employer and say, no, you should be employing people. Now, for employment rights, there is an avenue to take that employer. So the individuals, often with the help of a union, if they're in a major industry which is unionised, can go to an employment tribunal and say, hey, I want my employment rights, please. But that doesn't have any impact on the tax situation.
No.
But still, at least you can do that the right way around. But it's also the onus is on the individual to do it.
Yeah.
The tax man's coming in as like, we are the government and we're going to sort this out.
Yeah.
But they go straight to the individual. They ignore the actual, the would-be employer. And wouldn't that be helpful if they actually went to them and said, no, this is wrong. What you're doing here is wrong. You're exploiting these people.
Yeah.
So I find that a bit frustrating.
Yeah, it is, because like you say, the little people or little man or woman who's kind of go down a particular avenue in terms of the work that they like to do, they're coming into this market where these established practices already exist and this is how this world works, but you're not necessarily opting into it. Whereas obviously clients are really integral to the fact that these structures actually exist and these ways of working actually exist.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, we've touched on it briefly, MSC, Managed Service Company legislation, and the fact that obviously IPSE have got a chunk of clients that or contractors
members,
who are affected, members by it, who are affected by it. How worried are you about that piece of legislation and the current activity?
Yeah, quite worried about it. So, for those that don't know, the sort of long and short of it is that about 2 years ago in 2022, early 2022, people started getting letters through the door. They were called Reg 80s.
Yeah.
And suddenly HMRC was saying that we think you're a managed service company, basically. And it turns out that the reason why HMRC thought they were a managed service company is because each one of those people were working with an accountancy service provider, or an accountant basically, but a kind of an online accountant, a specialist accountant, which a lot of contractors use, these kind of accountants. There's quite a few of them out there. We think there might be around 50 of these kind of accountancy service providers that all seem to be, from looking at it from the outside, offering a pretty similar service to contractors. And HMRC decided that two of them, and I think we can name them because they've been named, it's Churchill Knight and Books. Books no longer operate, but they are still around trying to fight this case. Two of them, HMRC decided, were managed service company providers, something called a managed service company provider. And that means that it follows that anyone who uses the services of that provider is likely to be or might be a managed service company. HMRC have taken the view that they're all managed service companies, and it's kind of up to individuals to establish that they're not. It's difficult to have the argument over the providers legally, it seems. So the providers can't sort of go to court and say, we're not a managed service company provider for X, Y, and Z reasons. So it's up to the individual. Again, we're going back to the individuals. It's HMRC saying, oh no, we're going to go straight to the little guy and say that you owe us all this tax because you're a managed service company, because you were working with a managed service company provider. And the managed service company providers there saying, we're not a managed service company provider. But HMRC say, well, we think that they are. Don't ignore them. They're out of this now. We're after you, the managed service company. And we understand that something like 1,500 contractors were caught up in this initial investigation. The initial tax year, although the letters came in 2022, but they were looking at the 17-18 tax year. And then since then, they've had further Reg 80s for further tax years. So the amount of tax that they're seeking to get is adding up. And for most of them that we've seen, we're talking about maybe tens of thousands. For a few, we're talking maybe 100,000, that sort of. So it's big money. It's ruin your life, ruin your business kind of sums of money that's up for grabs. And it's we're in what seems to be well, we talk about this sometimes, don't we, Seb, separately, but we're in what seems to be a sort of grey zone at the moment where no one knows what's going on. We haven't had a tribunal yet. There's rumours that we might get one in the next, say, 6 months, but then actually I've heard that rumour for the last 18 months, so I can't say, and HMRC want to take some test cases and essentially see if, again, it comes. So a couple of things. First of all, we've got this legislation here which sets sets out a path for HMRC to go directly to the little guy. The little, by the way, these taxpayers, their argument is, I use an accountant so that I could be tax compliant. That's why I use an accountant. The tax system is complicated. HMRC are arguing, it's not totally clear what their arguments are, but it seems as if the legislation says that the accountancy service providers or managed service company providers, as they see them, were benefiting from these businesses on an ongoing basis. But it's like, well, that's anyone, isn't it? You know, or they're influencing the business. Well, anyone's influencing the business. But the taxpayers are saying they just sort out the sort of tax and stuff that I have to pay. Which, as far as I ask them to do that so that I can make sure I'm tax compliant. I'm off running a business. I'm talking to the clients. I'm doing the work. You know, I'm marketing myself. I'm doing all of those things which make me a business. I'm just leaving this this complicated tax stuff up to what I thought was, you know, which probably is, but maybe is a good accountant. And I had no idea that you were going to come along and decide that they're a managed service company provider. And now I owe all this money and it's going to completely ruin my life. And so I really feel that this is a very hard put upon group of taxpayers here. And I'm very to go back to your initial question, Seb. I'm very worried and concerned for those that are in the current investigation. And I'm also worried and concerned that HMRC could decide to go after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 of the other 50 or so accountancy service providers
thousands
that are out
of
there.
Contractors.
And we're talking thousands of contractors. And none of them are aware that they were even potentially on the fringes of doing something wrong with this.
Exactly. Yeah,
so,
it's a horrible piece of legislation. Obviously, it's you know, one of the issues is that it just wasn't really tested since it came in 2007. You know,
no, that's right.
But it wasn't.
I have to confess, I never really thought about it because it came in 2007. I got into this world in 2010. I'm aware of it because it's in IT, in the Income Tax Earnings and Pensions Act. It's the technical stuff where the IR35 legislation is and all of that. So I'm aware of it, but I've always thought that doesn't affect us. That's not our members. That's not IPSE's area to sort of worry about. And all of a sudden it is, and it's crazy.
Exactly.
So we're really trying to highlight this because I do feel like if we can shine a spotlight on what's going on here, my hope is that someone in government is going to say, what are we doing? Why are we picking on these actually rather compliant businesses like this?
Exactly.
Why would we do that? Why would we go and try to ruin these businesses? And my hope is that someone's going to sort of bring HMRC to heel a bit and sort of say, no, we don't want to be carrying on in this way. And we have been trying to raise this in Parliament as well to start to... Now, it's going to be difficult because they're going to say, well, it's a legal matter now. So let's see where we get to. But I think that there's a dual thing. At some point, it will become a political argument as well.
You would think so. You would think so. It's just very slow moving at the moment, isn't it? So it's quite difficult to maintain that narrative when nothing is.
But we're trying to do stuff in the media, aren't we? So
exactly.
As I say, we're both in the papers today talking about this, and it has been talked about in bits of the media, but not hugely. No. But I do think that it will come back around.
Unfortunately, it could be the next big thing. It could be that next major issue. But it really wasn't what the legislation was designed for in the first place. You know, it's
it was all about composite companies. When I've spoken to senior people at HMRC a few years back about this, and they said to me, "Oh, it's fantastic managed service company legislation. We brought it in; it just sorted out the problem. There was all this non-compliance going on. So we brought in this legislation. It sorted it out. No more problem. Perfect.
Exactly.
Right? And now all of a sudden, out of the blue, we seem to be saying, "Oh no." There's this huge problem with managed service companies actually out there that we just haven't been talking about for years. And it's like, well, when did that switch happen? When did we switch from saying it's all fine, there are no managed service companies, to saying no, there's absolutely thousands of them?
Exactly.
And I think that the wording of the legislation is so broad that it's in the lack of cases as well.
It's so subjective.
That's that HMRC's kind of seems to be casting its net as wide as it possibly can by kind of bringing these types of cases into the mix under the legislation. And like you said, Andy, if they make progress with these, the domino effect that could in turn have against the kind of other 50 or so organisations and the thousands of contractors that they service, substantial representation of the contractor market as a whole in the UK.
And I guess from contractors' perspective more generally, it's a case of yet another attack on contractors.
Exactly. It does feel a bit like, you know, everyone's really got it in for this group of taxpayers, or everyone. I mean, HMRC do. And I don't know if that's really true. I mean, I do, because we go to the what used to be called the R35 Forum. It's now the Employment Status and Intermediaries Forum. Yeah. And there are some people within HMRC who do seem to be quite reasonable and do understand that there are going to be some working engagements which are not like a normal employment, and that can be accounted for in the tax system. Yeah. But then when you look at what the activities are of HMRC overall, it feels as if you're trying to not be an employee, or, you know, not be on the payroll, not be PAYE, they're going to try and come at you with some sort of reason for why that's wrong. Yeah. And it just doesn't suit everyone. Not everyone is an employee or an employer. And unfortunately, our whole tax system is built around employees and employers. Yeah. And as more people begin to step outside of that traditional model, there's this sort of frantic kind of like trying to push everyone back into the box, it feels. And that's what a lot of this legislation is really all geared towards, is just pushing everyone back into that. No, pay tax like an employee, get on the payroll, be an employee. It makes it much easier, doesn't it? Let's face it. I mean, if my job is to collect tax, I have to say, I would say it would be wonderful if everyone could just be on the payroll. Because every month, I've got a bunch of companies that just hand me all the tax and they do all the work for me, and it's wonderful. Right? Yeah. If everyone starts not doing that anymore, it does make life more complicated. But unfortunately, what we're saying is you can't kind of make people work around how your tax system works. You have to make the tax system fit with how people want to work. That's how the economy is going to grow and get better. So we need to be a bit more sensible and maybe think a bit more creatively and be a bit more prepared to have nuances and differences within our tax system that account for these different ways of working. And
I think ultimately as well, the contribution that self-employed people make to the UK economy is substantial. Like some of the research that IPSE have published recently talks to some of that as well. Yeah. It's a lot, and you would think that when you look at those types of numbers, that we would be a bit more supporting of kind of fostering entrepreneurialism and self-employment in the UK, both in terms of there being the necessary support for people, that taxes are fair and equitable, but there are no blockers to that entry to self-employment, and people aren't going to be deterred because actually there's all of this really complicated stuff that might catch you out at some point in time, and that the government and the taxman are potentially going to come after you at a point in the future.
Yeah, I think it is definitely a sort of disincentive, or it's a concerning factor if you work for yourself, that I think most people are worried about potentially. The tax man coming after them. I think that you're right to make our research. So we just did our landscape report, which we do every year. It comes out at the beginning of the year, and it looks at what the state of self-employment is in the country. And and this is all from the ONS. We haven't made this up. This is from ONS Stats, which we use an academic from Kingston University called Professor Kitchen, and it shows that they make an economic contribution to the economy. I think it was around, testing now, about 280 billion or something crazy. But because there are 400 million or so. It used to be 4 million self-employed individuals in the UK. 4.2, I think. It used to be 5, so it's gone down since the pandemic. And what's going on there? There's also a problem with the ONS have come out saying they're not sure about their own statistics as well. We have to say that. So that's getting better, apparently. I think they've solved it now, but they have said, we're a bit concerned about our self-employed numbers. So we'll see what happens when they get stuff together with their statistics a bit better. But it looks as if we've lost quite a lot of self-employed people in the economy. I don't know why that is. The pandemic had a big impact.
It was a huge impact, wasn't it?
That seems to be that people haven't quite come back into it as strongly. Obviously, IR35's come in as well. All the changes to off payroll have come in. So that's acting as another deterrent. But why aren't more people going into self-employment? I don't know, because it was going up and up and up.
It was
in the 2010s. It was
exactly.
Every set of stats was like another jump up.
Yeah.
So yeah. I've lost the thread of what we were talking about.
I think it's one of those things. We knew that there was going to be lots for us to talk about, and as soon as we start talking about IR35, it opens up all sorts of avenues for conversation. But I think one of the key things for me to get an understanding from you, Andy, is what the landscape for freelancers and contractors in the UK is looking like in 2024.
Well, again, if you give me a couple of months to get our survey results back in, I can I can explain that a bit more. I think that, I think let's try and find some positives here. I think that anecdotally on the IR35 front, we're hearing that there's a bit more nuance and softening from some clients that previously were saying absolutely no contractors ever to now saying no, in some circumstances we can take contractors in. So that's a positive. I think that the economy as a whole hopefully will get better in 2024. So obviously it's been a very difficult period with crazy inflation. And it feels like the most economists are predicting that that's going to get better, that we might have, that GDP might increase a bit more as well. So we might have a slightly better set of sort of economic conditions, and that could be a good time for people to start a business. And for, if they already have a business, for that business to have a good year. I hope so. I really do hope so. I mean, I can't really, I don't have my crystal ball on me, but I do, it feels like, we could have a good year. We just need a bit of support for self-employed, a bit of love, a bit more getting out of the way, and maybe a bit less hassle, and some clearer rules around tax and employment status, and we could have a really healthy, thriving self-employed sector that can make an even better contribution to the UK economy.
Amen to that.
One final, I suppose, plugging opportunity from an IPSE perspective, just all the things that you said there. What are IPSE's priorities for 2024 then in terms of supporting the self-employed workforce?
Some of the areas that we're going to be pushing the government on is around, obviously, the tax system, R35. We would love to make some good progress with the MSc stuff, and whether that's supporting our members in the tribunals, which might happen this year, I don't know, or in Parliament and with policymakers as well. We'd love to get... I feel like that's an area that we could maybe make some progress on, because it just feels so unfair what's going on. That I feel like if we can get into the right audience here, we can make a case that could be quite compelling for why something needs to change around that. So I'd love to do that. Away from the whole tax thing, we'd love to see more improvement on late payment. We are... We've been pushing the number 10 to form a kind of an ongoing committee with small business representatives, and I think we've got that now. So as you might know, they've got their business council, and they're all big businesses, and we, along with a group of other small business sort of representatives, said, hey, you're forgetting the little guy here. So I think we're going to be doing more stuff with number 10, which is great, and have a bit more of a sort of proper voice in there. So just getting it back on the agenda, really, because it's been a bit pushed aside. I think maybe, people working for themselves should be something which policymakers are thinking about a bit more than perhaps they're thinking about at the moment. So I think that's our job, is to try and make that happen this year.
Great.
Good. So I think we've only got one final question to ask you. Which is, if you could kind of put a question to our subscribers, said that really weird, subscribers, in terms of getting their perspective on a particular question or subject from you, what would that be?
So I would be interested to know how they feel they're perceived by others. So I'm interested to know, when you tell someone that you work for yourself, that you're self-employed, that you're a freelancer, you're a consultant, whatever term you use, but when it becomes clear that you're working for yourself, how do people react to that? Are they overwhelmingly positive? Do they tend to sort of say, oh, that's great, you've struck out on your own, I admire you for that? Or do they tend to be a bit suspicious and negative and say, oh, aren't you, avoiding tax, or can't you get a proper job? So, and I think that there's probably a bit of a mixture of those two things out there, but I'd like to know which one of those is winning at the moment. Because I think that depending on who you're talking to, you could get different responses.
Definitely.
That's
a very interesting question.
It is. So that's definitely something we'll be taking to our kind of LinkedIn subscribers and putting that question to them.
Great. Thank you.
Penno, thank you.
Thank you very much
for joining us. That was really, really good. So thank you everybody for tuning in today. If you want to see more of the podcast or listen to more of the podcast, make sure that you subscribe to our relevant social channels, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.